Well, if we listen to the gospel quickly, it might almost sound like Jesus is running for political office. He's trying to get the straw poll of who do people say that I am? Anyone, I suppose, in public life, or many of us in our professions may do the same from time to time. We may try to poll, how am I doing? What's the word on the street? What's my reputation like? Are people saying things about me? We sometimes wonder about these things and maybe even question it. Similarly, some of us go to that deeper level as did Jesus. Not only did he say, who do the people say that I am, but he twists that question to the disciples, who do you say that I am? Very personal and very clear. And sometimes maybe we do the same. We might go to a trusted friend, particularly if we have some deeper questions about our own life and who we are and the direction we're going. We may confide in them to see how we're being perceived and the direction we're on. I know myself, not that long ago, I had been challenged on some ways I made decisions, and that really called me to take that step back and look and say, what I'm hearing is not really what I've been planning to do, so I need to take that deeper look. Am I really on the right track or somehow not coming across correctly? So I called a couple closer friends and said, I really need to talk to you, confided in them in a humble way what was shared with me, and then I asked for their insight, their fraternal correction if needed. Is that what Jesus is doing today? Well, yes and no. Yes, Jesus, I think, wanted to know the word on the street. I think he wanted to know, I'm about halfway through my ministry, how am I doing? Are people understanding who I am? On the no side, Jesus did not need any fraternal correction, that's for sure. But on the yes side, Jesus did want an answer to a very personal question. Who do you say that I am? And of course, we know Peter, at the moment, Simon answers that question. Well, that same question maybe is for you and for me. Imagine Jesus saying to you, who do you say that I am? What is that answer? It's very important to really probe. In our younger years, as we are growing, we have many people trying to instruct us and tell us who Jesus is. Our parents do that, and grandparents, godparents, aunts, uncles, family, teachers, and religious educators, hopefully the priests, try to tell you who Jesus is. And as we grow older, we make those decisions. And sometimes, as we are listening to all of this, maybe some of what we hear, especially growing up, as we get a little older, can get a little confusing. It almost seems like it's arm's length away, some of what we're taught, or maybe lofty thoughts up in the sky. We'll hear things that Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus is a healer, Jesus is a teacher, he is the moral leader, he is the Messiah, he is the Lord of heaven and earth. All very correct answers. But if taken at surface, they can kind of be arm's length, It's not really very deep, very personal. Like most of us in our life, we gather data, we gather information, particularly about our own life experiences, and we draw conclusions. And so as we are growing older, especially for us older kids, to answer the question as well as our younger ones, who do you say Jesus is? Important question maybe to ponder through the course of the weekend. In the week ahead, who is Jesus? Second thing that we really hear a lot about this weekend in the readings are keys. We hear about keys. Both in the first reading from the prophet Isaiah, we hear about keys, and in the gospel, we hear about keys. Now, I know when I was growing up, particularly becoming a teenager, I could not wait to get my own set of keys to the house. And in those days, when I turned 16, I could not wait to get my own set of keys to the car. Now, I know they're fobs today, they're not keys, but, as we get a little older, maybe we can't wait until we get that set of keys, if it be to the house or to the car. Why? Well, it's a privilege, that's why. Responsibility comes with it. And really, an implied obedience comes. If we're going to be entrusted with keys to the car or to the house, well, it means we've achieved some level of obedience in our duties. They're a sign of freedom and maturity and authority. And right now I have so many sets of keys, I'm willing to give a couple of them back, But keys really mean all of that. If you take that to the gospel reading and to the readings, what do we hear? In the gospel, of course, Jesus asked Simon, "Who do the people say that I am?" And then tweaks the question, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter gives the answer. And what happens to him? Well, first of all, his name changes. That's what happens to him. He goes from being Simon to being Peter. And he's given a promise. The jaws of hell, the jaws of death will not prevail against the church. He's also declared to be the rock upon which the church will be built. And he's given the keys to the kingdom. He is Jesus' prime minister, if you will, a meaning of those keys. He is given the power to bind and to loosen. He's given that power. Well, in the first reading from the prophet Isaiah, we learn about the role of the prime minister. We hear the prime minister receive the keys. Isaiah talks about that. And we hear that Eliakim became the prime minister. He was given a robe and a sash. He was given the keys as a sign of his authority. It was Eliakim's control to lock the doors. He would keep intruders out and protect the inhabitants inside of the kingdom. Well, we see with Peter, our first pope, whose name changed, and the Pope always changes their name today, sign of a new relationship with the Lord. What does Peter remind us? That God has a plan that he's made for all of the centuries. God acknowledged that we will need a servant leader. God acknowledged that he needs to speak to bring order through this leader to the chaos of the earth. And this leader is to govern. The leader, the Holy Father, is to have a heart for God and to provide for the Lord's church. The kingdom on earth is the Lord's church. The leader of the church has got the firm foundation of truth, and the church is the firm foundation of mercy. These are the things that we're built upon. The keys have been passed from Peter to Francis today in an unbroken succession. The succession of Peter continues to have that authority to bind and to loose. And what does that exactly mean? Well, binding and loosing is used in the scripture here as a rabbinical term. It translates most perfectly to forbidding and permitting. When we talk about the Holy Father having the power to bind and loose, it means he gets to speak as to what is forbidden, and he gets to speak on behalf of God as to what is permitted. In Jesus' time, the Pharisees took that role on themselves. They decided what was forbidden and permitted. But Jesus is the one who rightfully has that power, and he gives that power to Peter, and from Peter in the unbroken succession to Francis today. So what does it really mean to bind and loose? It means that the Holy Father today has the right, the obligation to interpret divine law and to apply divine law to modern circumstances. And if you think about our own lived experiences, many of the Pope's statements are not too well received. Some of his decisions and statements become rather controversial as he decides what is bound, what is loosened, what is forbidden, what is permitted. topics like genetic engineering or climate change or gender and sexual morality, and the list can go on, when the Pope makes statements about these matters, very often they are not well received. It is interesting to note that the world wants to know what the Pope has to say. If you remember back when Pope, now St. John Paul II, died, I remembered in 2005 a friend of mine called me. He's Episcopalian, and he said it was mentioned in his church by the pastor and said, the Holy Father died, and although as Episcopalians we don't follow the Pope, the pastor went on to say, we all look to him to be the moral beacon for the world. Not a bad endorsement from a Protestant minister, And if you remember back to the pandemic and coming out of it, the world wanted to know what the Pope had to say, especially about vaccinations. Anytime something goes on, the world wants to know, what does the Pope have to say? Well, if we think about a controversial issue, one perhaps that we don't talk enough about, the controversial issue of contraception. It's about a half a century ago, Humanae Vitae came out, and it was a rather controversial document. Many did not want to accept what the Holy Father was teaching about the openness to life and birth. So we're about a half a century later. Where are we, particularly in light of the many who rejected that teaching? Well, we've gotten smaller. That's where we are. Families are not as large as they used to be 50, 60, 70 years ago. They're smaller. And there are fewer baptisms today. If you look at our register, and those for pretty much every church in the diocese, and probably the nation, the number of funerals are double the number of baptisms. Very sincerely. If you don't believe me, you can come and look at the books. You'll see the number of funerals are double the number of baptisms. And we know that we have fewer Christian children. At the same time that we see what? In the nation and world, a substantial rise in the Muslim population. The birth rate for Muslims in our nation is about 8.0. And we see a real shift. And what is it that we see? Well, if you follow the news at all, particularly in our nation and Detroit and the surrounding suburbs, the majority of elected leadership is now of the Muslim religion. And I mean absolutely no disrespect to those of the Muslim faith. But if we remember, our nation was founded as Judeo-Christian, and many of our laws were Judeo-Christian. Of course, in recent years, many of them were secular, relativistic laws. And what they're experiencing now in Detroit is a little bit of a shift, as those who are of the Islamic belief are bringing their beliefs to the laws they're enacting. And if you look to France and follow any news out of France, France is slated by the middle of this century to be a Muslim nation. And a lot of controversy in France in recent years as the tensions are mounting. Again, no disrespect to the Muslim people, but by the same token, a Judeo-Christian culture is different than an Islamic culture. They're very different in many, many ways. We need to perhaps take seriously what we see going on. If you are a student of history and believe that history repeats itself, I have mentioned many a time to read Revelation chapter 2 and 3 because they're the message of the angel to the 7 churches. And these 7 churches were the very first churches founded by the apostles themselves and the early Christian community. They were the hotbed of Christianity. They were the 7 major churches. And none of them exist today as Christian land. They are all Muslim nations in Turkey and so on. If you're a student of history, perhaps you'll see history repeating itself. There is a positive side, though, in the gospel today, and the positive side is that God will always be faithful to his people, and the promise that the jaws of death will never prevail against the church. We're promised that Jesus is always going to provide leadership for the church, particularly in Peter and his successors, as we try to understand the gospel and how it applies to the challenges today. And so perhaps the two questions really to reflect on this week. Who do you say Jesus is for you? And are you willing to listen and to accept his authority, particularly coming from his vicar, the Holy Father, into your life?